Hi, I'm David Shipler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Two reporters. Start now. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Danny. How you doing?
Great, thanks. And here's our mission today. We're going to find out how TV and radio programs can teach people to stop hating each other. And that means those programs might actually help stop people from killing each other.
Our guest today and his colleagues have created TV and radio programs in countries where members of different ethnic groups, religions, tribes have repeatedly slaughtered each other, such as Rwanda, where Hutu death squads massacred between 500,000 and possibly up to 1 million Tutsi and moderate Hutu in 1994. Human rights groups don't know the exact number, but it was a huge genocide. And there have been ethnic massacres in Burundi and Congo and other countries.
But our guest has found that their TV and radio programs have helped transform how some people think about their lifelong enemies and how they treat them. John Marks, welcome back for another episode.
Well, I'm very happy to be here with you guys, and thank you very much.
John, do you ever blush when you hear what you have succeeded in doing?
Yeah, I get a lot of satisfaction from it, and I always seem to want a little more. I mean, I don't think I'm obsessed with it, but that notion of wanting to have increasing successes and continuing successes probably still resides in me as put into my head by my parents 70 years ago.
Well, when Dave asked you if you ever blushed, you broke into a big grin. So I think that was part of the answer.
John created an organization called Search for Common Ground.
He started with a handful of colleagues, and today they run peace projects in more than 30 countries. They have more than 800 employees.
He's retired now from that organization, but his book just came out, a memoir, a guidebook really, on how to do all this. It's called From Vision to Action, Remaking the World Through Social Entrepreneurship. I should say, in the interest of full disclosure, that John hired one of my children years ago, my son Michael, who is now a vice president of Search, and he's had a wonderful experience in that wonderful organization.
And as John told us in our last episode, their philosophy has always been, wait a minute, if we could all open our hearts and minds to the people we perceive as enemies, just think what we might accomplish. So Search brought spies together from the Soviet Union and the United States, and they convinced their governments to collaborate on common projects. They brought Iranians and Americans together, and for a while, Search helped break through years of hatred.
Today, we're going to look at another one of your strategies, which is your use of broadcast, radio and television, to try to change the way millions of people think about people across the lines of difference. It started, I believe, in Burundi, in Central Africa, back in 1994. Take us there, would you, John, and tell us what happened?
Well, we were challenged to go into Burundi after the genocide in Rwanda.
And just to help take you back to that horrific time, we have a news clip.
There are some stories that can never be told. This is one of them. A calamity of such epic proportions, so massive in size and scope, the truth of it is far beyond journalism.
Burundi had the same ethnic mix of Hutus and Tutsis, and they were killing each other, though not in the genocidal level yet. And we went in and, among other things, started a radio studio. It was called Studio Ijambo, a place where people talk together. And the idea was to have programming that changed attitudes and behaviors.
And wait a minute, could I ask something? So you're sitting down with your colleagues, in the U.S. or wherever, and in Burundi, and you're saying, wow, what can we do to stop this killing and prevent it from exploding like it did next door in Rwanda? What made you think, a radio station?
Well, we wanted to reach a large number of people. And in fact, the origin of it was a colleague who was a more adversarial person than I was, asked us to set up a radio jamming operation. And I said, we don't do radio jamming. That's not our work.
You mean to jam hate radio, because there is a lot of hate radio in that part of the world.
Yeah, and there was hate radio breaking out in Burundi.
As there had been in Rwanda also.
as there had been in Rwanda, and which had played a very important part in the Rwanda genocide. Hutus were calling Tutsis cockroaches and said they had to be stamped out.
Why does that sound familiar right now in the United States?
You answer the question. So I said in return that we didn't do radio jamming. That wasn't in our bag of tricks. But what we would do is what I called common ground radio, which was radio that brought people together, that fostered dialogue, that tried to overcome ethnic and religious differences and the like. And we set up a studio rather than a station because stations get closed down by governments and you need all sorts of permits. And what we did is we set up a studio that produced up to 15 hours a week of original programming, which we offered for free to every radio station in the country. We'll give you free material. All you have to do is broadcast it. And most of the radio stations in the country accepted this.
Wow.
So we were putting out 15 hours a week on 3 or 4 different stations. We had an equal number of Hutus and Tutsis working for the studio.
They were willing to work together?
Yeah, that was part of their condition of their employment. You were supposed to leave your ethnicity at the door.
What was the content of the programming?
Well, there was lots of different content. We had our first soap opera. It was about a Hutu family and a Tutsi family, and they had problems, and their kids had problems. And in every episode, the problems would get solved. We had a disc jockey who did music for peace, local music.
You mean music with a positive message, that kind of thing?
Yeah, and the talk that came with it was positive. You know, some of it was just good music or good Burundian music, which wasn't my taste. But it was, it was communicating very well.
And we have a clip of one of your radio programs that gives a sense of what you're talking about.
This production, which reflects the realities of life after conflict, is normally hard.
This particular example is not from one of your programs in Burundi. It's from another country where you did similar work, Sierra Leone in Western Africa. And unlike most of your radio programs in various countries, this episode was in English, which is one reason we're playing it.
So here's a brief excerpt, and it might be hard to understand, but we want to play it because, for one thing, it shows how Search was producing real radio plays, kind of like the radio dramas I heard when I was growing up in the States many long years ago. This is a scene in which women are talking about getting up their courage to testify at a national commission that's investigating crimes against human rights.
Go ahead and testify.
We shouldn't keep silent. We women need to speak up. Everybody needs to speak up. We don't want these things to happen again.
Exactly.
Okay, ladies.
So, John, take us back, please, to your programs in Burundi.
We had another program which was documentary form about Hutus who had saved Tutsis and Tutsis who had saved Hutus. It was a weekly program, and we only thought that would go on for a year or so, and it went on for about 8 years, and we were flooded. There was a call-in segment, and people would call in with their own examples. And what we were trying to do was change the definition of heroism. It wasn't somebody who acted to protect his or her ethnic group. It was somebody who protected life, humanity. And that was very successful. A lot of officials figured we changed the definition of what a hero was in Burundi.
You know, it was very moving to read about that in your book.
Yeah, that's remarkable.
That show was called Pillars of Humanity, right? And you had the Burundi people and government held a big celebration, like an award ceremony, honoring the heroes who you had spotlighted in your programs. And in your book, you say it got huge reaction.
Yeah, we wanted to publicize it as much as possible because we were changing popular attitudes.
It also might change the definition of what we call news, which is usually conflict. Here you have people reaching across the lines of difference and, helping each other, saving each other. It's remarkable.
And you mentioned, John, 2 specific examples that helped show how much impact these programs had.
Mm-hmm.
One of them was that you say in 1998, so this was after you had been doing these programs for several years, the studio broke a story about a massacre that had been committed by government soldiers. And of course, they were mostly Tutsi, which was the opposite of Rwanda, where the people in power were mostly Hutu. And you said that several top government officials wanted to punish you guys for having this expose about alleged Tutsi killer soldiers. Tell us what happened.
Well, it was a very hard-hitting report. I mean, we had Hutus and Tutsis working together to do investigative reporting. And that report came out, and as you said, they wanted to punish us, I guess even close us down. And the president of the country himself said, no, the journalists were only doing their job.
And he was Tutsi.
Yeah. And we knew him. We had worked with him, and he was a relatively good guy.
And the government set up a commission of inquiry, isn't that right, after that episode? And there were some arrests also, I think you said in your book.
Yeah.
Several officers were actually arrested. And that was a first, I gather, for accountability for human rights abuses there.
And the incident was brought up to the UN Security Council as an example of progress towards ethnic harmony in Burundi. Well, that was the power of the media. And that's one reason we did it. We noticed that if you brought 30 or 40 people together in a room for a training or a dialogue, you didn't reach very many people. And this was reaching in the millions. The soap opera was getting 90% listenership in the country. 90% said they were listening.
Wow. You mentioned another example, which must have been terrifying. You said at one point, for purely technical reasons, the Burundi National Radio didn't broadcast your latest episode, and armed soldiers showed up at the studio, at Studio Jumbo. Tell us what happened.
Well, they scared our staff, let's just say. But what they wanted was not to shut us down or punish us. They wanted a copy of the missing tape because they said the soldiers were going to mutiny if we didn't provide it.
Wow.
Needless to say, we gave them a spare tape.
Dave, if only armed soldiers had ever showed up at our door saying, "Where's your latest program of Two Reporters podcast?"
Yeah. Too many weeks have passed since the podcast. Yeah. Well, it's worth pointing out that in those years, radio was the major means of communication in Burundi and many other countries. I mean, television was not widely, people didn't have TVs all over the country. So, radio really was the way. This has changed, hasn't it? I mean, with social media now, regular broadcast is not as effective, I don't suppose, as it was back in the mid-90s, is it?
Look, you'd have to look at individual countries, but I think in lots of African countries, it's still the way to reach a larger segment of the population. It goes out to the rural areas. People listen to it, and it's not everywhere. But you can't exclusively focus on social media in places where there's not very good internet. And even TV in some African countries might reach 50 or 60%, but radio usually reaches more than 90%. So we learned the hard way that going back to the earlier form was in many places a better way to communicate than the more modern form.
Just to remind everyone, we're talking with John Marks. He created the remarkable organization called Search for Common Ground, and he's just published a memoir of sorts about how he did it and how to do it, if other people want to know. It's called From Vision to Action.
You and your staff at Search for Common Ground worked on so many innovative projects involving radio and television in Burundi, in the Middle East, in other African countries. We don't have time to get into most of them. In fact, sometimes you write that you would show up in a country and discover that your local staff was doing projects you didn't even know about as the head of Search for Common Ground. And I'm thinking about an example where you walked from Burundi across the border into the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which Americans usually call Congo. And you discovered that Search had an office in a town you had never heard of, right? And I'm focusing on that partly because we don't hear about these countries much in the United States, whereas we hear about conflicts in the Middle East and elsewhere. So take us back there. You stroll across the border into Congo.
Yeah, we had a very strong, powerful country director in the Congo, Lena Slackmulder. And she was reporting to the African director. And let's just say I, as the president, didn't have much of an idea what they were doing. And I made a trip out there, and I was amazed by the work that we were doing. The program itself was pure Lena.
Well, talk about that, because the DRC program was quite remarkable. You created a project for the military that was really fascinating to read about in your book.
And this project, let me just add, this project was not a radio or television project in general, but it was an outgrowth of a popular radio series that you'd been producing, a fictional series about an evil army officer to teach people the right way to be a soldier and the wrong way to be a soldier.
That's right. The Congo at this point, and even today, was known as the rape capital of the world. Many of the perpetrators, most of the perpetrators, were military men.
This is one of the most dangerous places in the world for women, where even the severely disabled are not spared from rape. A policeman took advantage of this young girl, beating and sexually assaulting her.
And our country director, Lena, found people within the army who wanted to change things. And she didn't denounce the army for this kind of behavior, which was the way most of the human rights groups worked. Send them to the Hague for trial. What she did was she listened, and she found that there were people she could work with. And we set up, with the people in the army and the permission of the general staff, a program to retrain military people in observing human rights and not being sexual predators.
Let's pause there for just a moment before you go on and describe more specifically what this project did. Because going back to our first episode and conversation with you, when we talked about one of the principles that you had devised of doing this work, you used Aikido, the martial arts form, as an example, where you don't confront directly, you go 20 or 30 degrees off, you allow the attacker to kind of absorb the blow, so to speak, and
to divert their energy.
This sounds like an example of that, where she didn't confront directly the human rights violations.
That's exactly right. You've summed it up beautifully, David. What we did is we listened. It took about 3 years to build up sufficient trust and figure out how to put it together. And then we did it. The program included training sessions. Each battalion and each regiment had a committee set up to do this, which included the chaplains corps. Who knew that the Congolese army had a chaplains corps? But they did, and the chaplains didn't like that kind of behavior. And we had high officers, and our trainers were either current or former soldiers who also had been trained in conflict resolution, human rights observation, these kinds of things. We provided the money to bring people together, but it was a very small amount of money, and we were doing it across the entire country. And we provided unlimited amounts of Fanta soda, which in the Congo, orange Fanta soda was an incredible delicacy. And our trainings were punctuated with that.
Oh yeah, I love that where I was in various parts of the world. That orange Fanta soda, it was great.
I don't like it myself.
And John, what exactly did your team do in those training sessions? I mean, how did the trainers teach the soldiers, folks, by the way, you should not rape?
In the training sessions, the trainers provided examples of what was going on. They explained what international standards were, that this wasn't okay. There was an attitude previously in the Congolese army that raping women was a part of the spoils of war. And that was an attitude that we worked to change. We showed movies of women giving testimony and would bring women in who had been through this experience. And we tried to teach, let's just say, the proper conduct of a soldier in the Congo.
And we have an excerpt from one of your radio dramas about rape. Again, this specific excerpt is from one of your programs in Sierra Leone.
And again, it might be hard to understand, but in this scene, a military officer is telling a woman that if she doesn't have sex with him, he will rape her.
I've been waiting for this moment. Makusa, I go better for you lay down. Let me go. And satisfy me. You understand? No. And don't say where I look for you. Come on. Please, no. Undress yourself. No. Undress yourself. Come on, Makusa.
So that's the kind of thing you were doing in the training program you gave to the army in the Congo, the DRC.
And we had comic books made up, and the comic books featured the military officer who Danny mentioned, who did all the wrong things. And then we had another TV series which we made, which showed a cop who was not corrupt, not dishonest, not a rapist, and was doing it the right way. We brought the wives of soldiers in because very few wives like the idea of their husbands being rapists. I actually have on film officer's wife saying he was essentially a pig before he did our training. She says after he did the training, he came home and we fell in love again.
Wow.
And we raised enough money to eventually reach the entire army, over 100,000 soldiers with this retraining. And you never know how successful it was, how many women were not raped because of it. You can't prove a negative there. But I think the answer to that question is tens of thousands of women were saved. Another example was there was an attack of a rebel group in Limbashasi. And the battalion, which had just come out of our training, put down the rebellion in a way that didn't feature rape and pillage and human rights violations. And the commander said, we're no longer animals. We don't do it that way anymore. Now, what happened the next time and the next time, I can't tell you. But it certainly saved the city from being pillaged, which would have normally happened in terms of a military campaign of that sort to fight rebels.
Well, you said that there was an attitude that rape was part of the spoils of war. Did you get resistance in the army from officers or enlisted men at all to this idea that, I mean, this sounds like a real change in thinking and a change in concept, not just a behavioral change that you were going after?
I mean, I couldn't tell you the answer to that question. Look, if we trained 100,000 soldiers and only 10% got this, which would be a pretty high failure rate, that still means there were 10,000 soldiers who could have a behavior change. And dealing with mass numbers was very much a part of our strategy. You couldn't get to 100%.
And your evaluations, let me just quote from your book. You say the evaluators found 92% of the local population who they surveyed judged that abuses had been significantly reduced, and 89% believed that due to the joint military-civilian activities, there had been a marked decrease in forced labor, theft, extortion, and rape. Impressive.
Yeah, that was in one province or two provinces. That wasn't the entire country. But yes, we would do evaluations and we would get results like that.
Another project that you initiated and continued, and I think still is going on, is a TV and radio program series called The Team. It centers on actually most countries' soccer, well, football, as it's called everywhere else except the U.S., in which you put people from different ethnic groups together on a fictional team. It sounds like an ingenious idea.
Well, it started because an intern at Search came into my office in, I guess, the year that Germany was the host of the World Cup. I believe that was 2006. He asked me, what were we doing to take advantage of the World Cup, which was the most popular televised event in the world? And I said, well, we're not doing anything, but what a good idea. We really should be doing something.
I hope you gave that guy a promotion.
That was his one contribution.
The unsung hero.
It was a lovely contribution. I came up with a format which was to have the national team fictionalized and put onto that team the diversity of the country. So in Kenya, everybody would come from a different tribe on the team. In Morocco, it would have been urban and rural. And in Congo, as part of our program to stop rape, we had only girls on the team, and their problem was preventing sexual violence. And we did that kind of programming in 18 countries, 350 episodes altogether. And the core metaphor was if players did not overcome their ethnic differences, their religious differences, their gender differences, they would lose. And that everywhere was the core metaphor of the series.
We have a clip from one of the Kenya programs, the team, which you sent us. It's one of the few parts that I was able to find where there's some English.
The trust that Lulu has in you made me choose someone I can trust as the captain.
But I'm not from there. I'm from the other side of the country.
You come from the same tribe as the people who killed my wife.
And this series was popular in really popular in some countries. Kenya, I think, as one of them, right?
Right. In Kenya, I believe we were a top 10 TV series.
Danny, you reported for NPR from Kenya for a while. Was that program going on then when you were there?
No, it was not going on yet, unfortunately. But one thing that was going on, also unfortunately, is that there was terrible tribal violence stoked by the government, which supplied weapons and ammunition to the members of its favored tribe and helped organize them to invade the farms and homes of a rival tribe and kill people and take over the property.
John, do you have a sense in Kenya, for example, let's just take that example, of how this program, the team, affected that cross-tribal hatred? Do you have a sense of that?
Well, the evaluations, the independent evaluations showed that programming like this, that this programming changed attitudes and behaviors in a substantial part of the population. And we don't know how long that lasted, but people said it had changed them. And I think it's an effective way to do conflict prevention. It's not the only way. It's complementary of other things. It worked so well in the DRC and the Congo because we were doing all the other training too. These things played off each other.
Now, here's a philosophical question. In this area and in others, I would assume that it's desirable to go in and do projects and then hope that you work yourself out of a job. That is, that you're not needed anymore, that somehow they take root in the society and they're continued on their own. To what extent does that happen? And what is that really what Search's idea is? Or are you kind of stuck once you get into something like this to the point where you need to keep doing the same thing to keep arresting the hatred that can develop in the society?
Well, it's both. It's better to continue doing these things and not to stop, though to adapt them with changing circumstances. So 20 years later, we're still doing Studio Ijambo in Burundi, except there are no foreigners engaged in it. It's a local enterprise, and it goes on its own power. You do want to work yourself out of a job as foreigners, but you want to develop local capability of doing some of the same things. And I'd say about at least a half a dozen countries, Search is no longer engaged on the ground with foreigners. They become localized NGOs, localized non-governmental organizations. And there's an office that looks the same as it used to look, and they call themselves the legacy or followers of Search, but it's not Search itself. So you do want to work yourself out of the job, and that's the ideal situation.
Before we wrap up, we should stress that we don't want to sound like Pollyannas. Search's programs haven't eliminated violence in the countries where you've worked.
Right, and there have been violent outbreaks off and on between ethnic groups in Kenya. The government of Burundi has been accused by human rights groups of torturing and killing political opponents. There's an ongoing war in the Congo between the military and insurgents, and the United Nations says that millions of people there have been displaced.
But I think the point is, and we discussed this in our last episode, Search for Common Ground has helped bring more civility and more peace and more cultural understanding to pockets of those countries where it didn't exist before.
I think we made a difference. We didn't make a difference in every place we worked, and I don't think one could have. But I can point to things that we did that changed particular countries. And in a sense, what we were doing was keeping hope alive.
John Marks founded Search for Common Ground, and he ran the organization for many years. His new book is called From Vision to Action.
And that's it for this episode of Two Reporters.
You can hear us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and YouTube and other leading podcast sites. And please check out more of our work at tworeporters.org. I'm David Schipler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Please join us again soon for another episode of Two Reporters. Bye-bye.